All right, welcome. Let's talk about the Canucks and what they might look like this offseason and into next year. For the Canucks, they really need to start thinking about next year. And I think they started to kick that off with the Bo Horvat trade. So, cap space available at the moment, considering everyone they have signed through next year. They only have between $3.01 million and $6.01 million available. Again, the $3.01 million is with a $1 million cap increase. The $6.01 million is with a $4 million cap increase. That's kind of the minimum and maximum we've heard of how much the cap could increase this offseason. So let's dive into it. Again, most of their team is signed through next year. There are two extensions that kick in this offseason. So JT Miller will be making $2.75 million more against the cap for the next 8 years, beginning next year. And Kuzmenko gets a $4.55 million raise. Again, on a super cheap contract right now. I think he's like $950,000. That kicks up to $5.5 million next year for 2 years. All right, I don't know where I want to go next. I guess let's just go down the $5 million plus contracts. All the contracts that are $5 million plus on the Canucks signed through next year. First one is Elias Pettersson. The little green check mark means it's a good contract. Brock Besser, probably a little overpaid, slightly overpaid, considering his overall stats, but it's not a terrible contract. JT Miller, honestly, as much as like his attitude's kind of an issue, who knows how he is in that locker room? His extension hasn't even kicked in yet. He is a point per game player. He at least recognizes that he needs to work on his defensive play, and is very open about that. I think overall, the $8 million contract, annual average value contract extension it's not out of the realm of what he should expect to get paid every year. So I don't hate it as much as I want to. Next up is Kuzmenko. He's making $5.5 million next year. I think that's a good contract. Quentin Hughes I thought Quentin Hughes was making like close to $9 million. He's not. He's at $7.85 million, which is a good contract for what he provides. He provides a lot of offense. He's definitely not a defensive defenseman. I do have a lot of question marks about his defense. It's not the worst defense I've ever seen by an NHL player, but it's definitely not. It's not great. He's an offensive defenseman, and he's going to score points for your team. You need to pair him with a strong defensive defenseman to really get the most out of that pairing, the defensive pairing line. But overall, it's about right. It's not bad. Next up is Oliver Ekman-Larsson. Just a terrible contract. It's even a million less. Like there's $1 million retained by the Arizona Coyotes every year for the next 4 years starting this offseason. So even with that salary retained, it's still not a good contract. Thatcher Demko, honestly, his contract's pretty fair. I know he's had some struggles this season. He also played an all-star level last season. He also really doesn't have much of a defense in front of him. So you have to factor all these things in. We see goaltenders struggle when the defense is struggling in front of them. We've seen goaltenders thrive when the defense is thriving in front of them. For the most part, and not entirely, but for the most part, they go hand in hand. Overall, I think Thatcher Demko is a very, very good goaltender, having a down year. I think the team, the ownership, the management needs to address the defensive aspect of this team, and Demko should be fine. That's my projection anyway. Obviously, that's a little more controversial, and it's a lot of theoreticals right there. But anyway, they have 7 contracts, $5 million or more. They have 2 that are close that I threw in there, which is Connor Garland, $4.95 million. Not the greatest contract. It was fine when he signed it in Arizona. It hasn't really lived up to that contract in Vancouver. And Ilya Mikheyev, $4.75 million. Bit of an overpayment there too. I like Mikheyev a lot, and there was a lot of eyebrows raised when this contract was initially signed in Vancouver. I had hope, and I think some other people had hope that this would pan out well. I really like Mikheyev's game. I think he has a lot to offer, but just the numbers he's put up is it's not indicative of that contract number, and That's fine. And like I said, I swear by this. This isn't a recognition of the players. It's more reflective of the general manager that signed these players to these contracts or acquired them with these existing contracts. Um, so there you have it. Unrestricted free agents. You got Michael Furland. His contract finally expires. $3.5 million off the book. You got Colin Delia, who's played well. But who do they have? They have Demko, assuming he's healthy, and Spencer Martin signed through next year. So we could see Delia back in the AHL. We could see, I don't know. We could see Delia get a backup job elsewhere, maybe with the Islanders next year. Who knows? Kyle Burrows, unrestricted free agent. Luke Shen, unrestricted free agent. Luke Shen's been very good on that blue line. Hasn't looked great on other in other scenarios, but Vancouver on that blue line with Luke Shen, it just works. I think if he stays, he gets some type of pay raise, which is deserving. I'm skeptical that I have a feeling he's going to get dealt at the trade deadline this year. We'll see. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. One day at a time, but interesting. And DiGiuseppe is a free agent as well. Restricted free agents gets a little more interesting, but not really. You got Ethan Bear, who's played decent on that blue line. You got Travis Dermott, you got Lockwood, and you got Höglander. None of these guys should command an exorbitant amount of money. Höglander, we should see a pretty low cap hit for that. He hasn't spent too much time in the NHL, and he's produced decently when in the NHL, but he's still the young kid. He's still developing. You wanna bring him up right. You want to let him develop properly. But overall, I don't think many of these guys will get much of a pay raise in general. But that's really it. Forwards, what they have for next year, they have 15 forwards signed through next year. That's already too many. Not to mention, guys like Furland and, I don't know, Höglander still down in Abbotsford. You got 5 defensemen signed and 2 goaltenders signed. Again, does not include Connor Delia. We'll see what happens with that. And overall, though, they really just need 2 defensemen. Maybe a depth goaltender to be in the AHL, because you never know with goaltender injuries. You never know if you'll have to rely on that depth goaltender to play a few games. But let's talk about the concerns and the positives. I'm going to start with the positives. They have a really strong young core. Their core pieces are young, and they're talented, and they're solid players. They also have solid offensive pieces. They don't have as much of an issue scoring goals as they do keeping the pucks out of their own net. Even before Bruce Boudreau took over, who tends to boost up an offense quite a bit. And we'll see with Rick Tocchet. He's more of a defensive-minded coach. He really buys into that team defense system. We'll see how much the offense suffers, but I don't think it's going to suffer all that much, to be honest. There are some talented goal scorers on this Vancouver Canucks team. It's just, I think a lot of teams would be excited to have some of the pieces the Canucks have. And the last thing is they have tradable pieces. If you need to commit to the retool or rebuild or whatever you want to call it, you have pieces you can trade for some pretty valuable assets. I'm just saying, the Kuzmenko thing, they could have gotten a haul for Kuzmenko at that cap hit. Almost any competitive team would be buying into obtaining Kuzmenko. And then you could be talking about, because it'd be a low first-round pick, you could talk about multiple first-round picks going to the Canucks in exchange for Kuzmenko and maybe a prospect or something. There's a lot of pieces that could work. So there's also that. But in general, they have tradable pieces. They have guys that aren't on exorbitant contracts and have played well enough to at least get some attention from teams trying to buy at the trade deadline or acquire the right pieces over the offseason. So there are definitely a bunch of untradeable pieces, but I think for the most part, a good chunk of this team is tradable, which a lot of teams can't necessarily say with the cap restrictions we're seeing in the NHL. Concerns, I got defense start because that is my biggest concern with the Vancouver Canucks for years now. It's their defense. There's a lot of focus on defensemen providing offense in the NHL these days. It's rare you really see a good defensive defenseman go in the first round. A lot of the defensemen that go in the first round are offensive defensemen. Part of that is because the offense and the points gets you a little more recognition, kind of gets your name out there a little more. Um, but at the same time, it's called defense for a reason. You need some type of defense in there. I have a lot of questions with this. The Canucks defense, in all honesty, it just looks like Swiss cheese. And I'm talking about the defensive core. I speak a lot to team defense and defensive play from the forwards. It's really not terrible overall with the Canucks in terms of getting their forwards play defense. There are teams that are a lot worse. Ottawa Senators, I'm looking at you. But their defensive core as a whole, it's not great when it comes to playing defense. They get points, they play some offense, that's great. But you need an anchor on that back end at the very least that can play top line minutes. That is a shutdown D-man. That's what they need. If they can get two solid defensive defensemen, you can even pair them with offensive defensemen. You can really start to make that work. But there are a lot of questions on that back end, and I have goaltending right under that. Demko having a down season. Delia's been all right. Martin's been okay, but at the same time, you're not seeing like Vezina numbers from these guys or anything even close to that realm, which you don't really expect maybe from Demko. But like I said earlier, a lot of the goaltending numbers and the defensive numbers typically go hand in hand. So I think you fix the defense, and goaltending gets a lot better, and then you have a better idea of what you have in your net. Is Demko really that poor, or was it just the defense letting in some brutal shots in front of him? And I'm not getting into the analyticals and stuff. With goaltenders, I think it's really indicative of the team you're playing on more so than what the numbers tell you. If you're gonna have negative numbers in analytical stats, you're gonna have poor analyticals if you're on a bad team for the most part. Especially with goaltenders, I'm not a big fan of the goals saved above expected. There's a lot it accounts for, but there's a lot it doesn't account for. So always take those stats with a grain of salt. I try not to look at them, partly because Demko doesn't have the greatest analytical stats. I take that with a grain of salt. I'd rather see the defense get bumped up first, and then we can see if his analyticals start to magically improve with that. Usually you want to see his analytic numbers be consistent throughout a person's career, and then that tells more of a story. But we haven't seen that with Demko from even last year to this year. Very, very polar opposite stats from last year to this year. Gotta fix that defense first, in my opinion. Let me know if you think otherwise. Next thing up is cap management. They've done the Canucks general manager has done a poor job managing this cap. That's just the reality of it. They're always up against the cap. There are some pretty brutal contracts, like the Ekman-Larsson contract. He signed after this year. He signed for 4 more years at $7.26 million. So, that's 9% of your cap on the back end with one player who isn't a top pairing defenseman. That's a significant amount. You got Tyler Myers. Oh, I forgot to put Tyler Myers up here. That's not a good contract. He's making $6 million. He's signed through next year, making $6 million. Not the worst defenseman ever, but not great. Not a top pairing defenseman. So there's that, right? Right? You signed Tyler Myers. You brought in Beauvillier, which scoring at a third of a point per game for $4.15 million. Signed through next year. You got to pay him through next year. Bo Horvat's contract expired. Now you're picking up an extra $4 million for next year. There's some questions that need to be answered. You got Connor Garland, signed for 3 years after this year. You got who else was I just talking about? Mikheyev, because he's on the LTIR, signed for 3 years after this year's done. Tucker Poolman signed for 2 years after this year. say what you will about Poolman. He has some really good games and he has some awful games. And then he has games where he's just getting into trouble with every player on the ice. It's just he's a weird player. But still, there's questionable cap management. They're always at the top of the cap. They're at the point where they have to trade assets to dump salary caps or bad contracts. And that goes hand in hand with the prospect pool. The prospect pool in Vancouver isn't great. It's not as bad as some other teams like the Penguins or the Bruins or I was gonna say Kings, but Kings are one of the best teams in terms of the prospect pool. But the Canucks, they're not the worst. They're not in like the bottom of the barrel, but they definitely don't have a lot down in Abbotsford that they can call up, or a lot in juniors, or a lot of unsigned prospects. There are some. I mean, you still got Hoglander in the AHL. You just called up I don't even remember the other guy's name. I'll find it real quick. Podkolskin. Right? You just got called up. It's a good prospect. Kid's still only 21. Unbelievable. So you got that. You got some pieces, but you need more. You need to be able to call guys up and have guys play on cheaper contracts and get production out of them for a few years. So there's some major concerns with this team. I think, honestly, you don't have to do too much, but you got to fix the defense, and I think you need to start by fixing the defense. And it's tough with some of these contracts, like you buy him out, it's going to extend for years later. And some of these contracts, it's going to be more expensive to buy them out than just let the contract expire because of signing bonuses and all that fun stuff. So I don't know, man, but I think there's potential here. There's hope. I'm that guy that picked him to get that last wild card spot in the Pacific this last offseason. Their defense has really let me down, in my opinion. I don't see them making the playoffs this year, but there are things they can do to really fix this and address this, and not even go into a full-blown rebuild. I know that they've needed to for years and years, but I think they have a lot of assets and a lot of pieces where you have to trade around some people. You're going to have to part ways with people you didn't really want to part ways with, in my opinion. But there's a lot you can do to make this team competitive and make this team a potential contender. I don't think they're so far off you need to do a rebuild. But you got to do something because the state of the Canucks right now is not great. So let me know what your thoughts are. Drop them below. Canucks fans, we've had our differences. I'm a Bruins fan, but I feel it for you guys. I'm sorry. I'm sorry you have to endure this team. And I don't even want to say mediocrity, like lack of mediocrity, and lack of improving. So I'm sorry. That's got to be brutal to watch. It's a diehard fans in that market. It's a great hockey area. Yeah, I feel for you guys. Anyway, let me know what you guys think. What do you think they should do? Do you agree with my analysis on the concerns? Do you have other concerns? Let me know. I don't watch a whole lot of West Coast hockey, but when I do, I watch really three teams. It's the Kings and the Kraken and the Canucks, because they're the most intriguing to me. But that's just my little hot take. But I got some insights to the Canucks, but if you watch Canucks every night, like I don't do that, let me know what you think. Let me know, right? Maybe I'm way off with rating these contracts. I wasn't even going to do it, but there are some contracts that are kind of brutal. Kind of made it a little fun, but yeah. All right, that's it for this. Appreciate you guys watching. Take care, all right?